All right, so today I'm going to be taking a stab at sculpting classic Link. My favorite version of Link was always the one found in the old NES manual. I always liked kind of the intrigue and at the time of seeing these drawings that looked like they came straight out of an animated show. And that's always stuck with me. And that's always been my favorite Link. He's sort of similar to Wind Waker Link, but with more of a classic 80s cartoon look. As always, I just start with some simple shapes, blocking them in. Use the tube tool for pretty much all the limbs in the body and a sphere for the head. Got a tube tool going for the hat and for the hair. And when I use the tube tool or the curve tool, whatever you call it, I'll hit the multi-radius button to where you can adjust the thickness of each of the control points on the curve. And so that way for the chest, I can increase the thickness for the chest and make it thin where the belt goes. Here I'm building the shield. I just scaled down a cube, flattened it, and then used the trim tool to cut it into shape. And now working in the basic features of the head, just using the move tool and the clay tool and smoothing things out. Got another sphere in there for the nose. And now I'll block in the eyes, turn on mirroring for the eyes, place the spheres in there. Once again, these videos aren't meant to be full detailed tutorials, but hopefully they give you a good sense of workflow. And more than anything, it's just to show you the process that goes into making a sculpt like this. All along the way, I'm adding some color because I think that really helps for such a simple form to really define the silhouettes and be able to read the silhouettes of each shape. I've got some spheres in for the eyes, adding some spheres in for the ears and using the move tool to shape those in place, and then my sharp brush to cut in the details on the ears. All the while I smooth things. Occasionally I'll get confused and I'll think the smooth tool's not working, and a lot of times what's happened is I've accidentally double tapped or I think hit the face button on the pen, and what that does is that switches into the alternate version of the tool, in which case for the smooth tool it turns on that relax mode. So just be aware of that. If something isn't behaving properly, it's always possible you've turned on the opposite function of the tool. And that can be really easily done with the second generation Apple Pencils just by accidentally tapping it wrong. So be aware of that. I like to use the sharp brush to create folds, clay buildup to build up the forms. Here, just moving the hair into place, and there I am using clay buildup on the hat. And then once I get the tube kind of into place I really like, I'll go ahead and validate the curve and then just use the move tool from then on to get it where I need. You can only do so much with the tube tool in its primitive form, so you want to get as close as you can with it and then validate it and take it the rest of the way there by just traditional sculpting. I've used another tube to wrap around to the back of the head and just fill in the rest of his hair there, as well as two individual tubes for the sideburns. So once again, this is my favorite iteration of Link. It's somewhere between the classic NES Link and the Link of the Game Boy or Game Boy Color, and even somewhat of the Super NES Link. I know the new Zelda is coming out here in about a week, and it looks really exciting, although, to be honest, I found myself pretty hooked on emulators running old software. I went out and picked up something called an RG35XX. It's a really cool Game Boy looking emulator and runs all those old machines and games from my past. So I've been going back through and enjoying some of the old Links. Just a couple years ago, I picked up the old Game & Watch, the Nintendo Zelda Game & Watch they released that had, I believe it had Link to the Past on there, Link's Awakening, and then the original NES Link. And again, I think that's right where this guy comes from, this design of the character. Also, instead of the traditional Hyrule shield, I'm giving him the cross shield, so you'll see me flatten some cubes out, and I'll build a red cross. Right here, I'm building the blade. I've got a great detailed tutorial on making the blade from Black Cauldron. I'm kind of using similar techniques here, although to be honest, I probably would have really benefited from going back and watching my tutorial because there was a little bit of experimentation, and I think in the Black Cauldron tutorial I had a little bit better approach here, but I knew it was similar. So, but basically what I did is I created a primitive cube, rotated it 45 degrees, and then I zeroed out the pivot on it. You can go in and edit the pivot and rotate the pivot and lock it and reset it. And then I was able to scale in the diamond shape and flatten it the way I wanted. Now, sculpting tools, all digital sculpting tools have a really hard time with really thin shapes. So what you'll see after I wrestle with it a while, what I ended up doing is I ended up using the scale tool and making it really thick and then defining the details and then flattening it back down. And that really helped. Here you can see I'm working on a much thicker version of the blade, and it really allowed me to use the flatten tool and the smooth tools the way I wanted, and the pinch tools. So there I am, just pinching the edges of the blade, and you'll see I'll do some flattening. And then once I get it where I'm happy, I then scale it back in. The focus of this whole sculpt isn't the blade, so as much as time as I spend on the blade, I really just need it in a decent place, and I think this is just fine. Here I'm trimming a cube so I can get the handle of the blade. Something really simple. And I ended up having to trim the top and the bottom. It was giving me some weird artifacting. Now that I've got the blade in, it's really good, really easy to get the full pose of this character worked in. And I'm adding some spheres for hands, continuing to adjust the face. We'll add some brows in here with some other tubes. It's easy when you work on any piece of art, whether it's sculpture or drawing or animation, to just kind of be all over the place. And there's really nothing wrong with that. You just kind of work on an area till you get bored with it, and then just move your attention to something else and come back. And you'll see I do that in all my sculpts. I'm always hopping from one piece to the next. Here I've turned off symmetry on the face to give it some interest on that mouth, break up the symmetry in the head. Adding some black tubes for the eyelashes really helps define the cartoon kind of almost anime quality to those eyes. They usually have a really defined upper eyelashes. Here I'm using the clay tool and the sharp brush to work in some folds on the clothing. Some natural folds on the arms. I had to go ahead and validate the tubes on his arms to do that. Kind of wrestled with the folds in the back of the hat, and you'll see I'll come back and forth to those. What I probably should have done is, here you see I'm painting the front of the hat, or the brim of the hat. What I probably should have done is masked it and then split it off. And I actually eventually did that in the end. I don't think I even show it here in this video. But after when it took it through Nomad, I went ahead and pulled things over in a blender to get a nice final render and some fuzz on his clothes and stuff. And when I did that, I went ahead and split the brim of his hat. That said, I was really happy with the pose and final render I was able to get here in Nomad. And you'll see that at the end of this video, the turnaround in Nomad. And you can see I'll show both the turnarounds of the final sculpt in Nomad, and I'll also show the final blender render. You can kind of see and compare and contrast. Here I'm using sharp brush to kind of add in some detail around the shield. Use the clay brush to create some rivets, and I'll come back and do that a little bit more in a little bit. Here I'm masking off the legs, and just messing with the extract. I kept hitting extract. What I really needed to do was hit shell to get the result I wanted. And I think what I ended up doing is splitting it. And then I took the split and I just used the inflate brush. That also works. It was just a little rusty on some of those tools. It's sometimes just really easy to forget the options and the verbiage around the tools. But that said, there's always more than one way to do things. So splitting it off and inflating it worked just fine. Here I validated the hands, and I'm using the smart brush and clay inflate to suggest some fingers. I'm not going to get really detailed with the hands and the fingers. I think he works just fine just with some suggestions of them. I'm not looking for an extremely detailed sculpt here. I want something that's just very simple and reads really well, has strong design to it. Since I've been playing some of the old games, one of the old games I recently played, a game I used to play as a kid, was called Princess Tomato in the Salad Kingdom. And it always had a really cool box art of this clay cucumber knight and tomato characters. And believe it or not, that's some of the inspiration of kind of where I was going with a sculpt. I wanted something that read really well without a lot of material detail. And that was part of the goal of my end render, although I ended up, once I get in Blender, I always get a little carried away, and I did add some cloth and some fur to him. But that's definitely in the vein. If you guys have ever played that game, if you haven't, it's probably not worth playing unless you have a lot of nostalgia for it. But, if you have, there's a good chance you played it and never finished it. But it's great to go back and revisit those games and then follow online guides so you can actually play through and finish games that you never finished as a kid. Here I just created a torus and simplified the geometry of the torus to get that belt shape. Really easy to do. So you just really play with the divisions on the torus, and then you do some linear subdivisions at the end. But really easy way to get that belt buckle shape. All right, I'm using the sharp brush on the hair and adding some detail. I will go back in on the hair and add some other tubes, just some detail tubes or secondary hairs to finish it out. And there you see I've gone back in and added some further refinement of detail in the shield. Here I am adding the detail in the hand. Again, I'm not going to get carried away, just using a sharp brush, inflate, clay tools, just some basic tricks just to work in the suggested details of the hand, especially that hand that's behind the shield you'll hardly ever see. And I use the sharp brush to add some little cuts into the blade just for fun. It's always fun adding like little details like that. Kind of adds to the illustrative, I guess is the word, quality to it. A lot of comic artists will use these little dashes and stuff for scratches, and so that's kind of what I'm doing there with the sharp brush. So I figured I'd add a boomerang. It'd be really easy with a tube. So you can see just adjusting that tube, pulling the divisions down somewhat, validating it, and then shaping it. I also scaled that tube to flatten it as I was shaping it. Rotate it in place, and then I'll just put a little cylinder here that wraps around the belt so it looks like that boomerang's just it's attached to his belt that way. We'll add a cylinder that we can use as a floor, and I'll eventually paint that green and get some grass spots in it. And I'll add some tube grass, really easy. Just do one, clone it around a couple of times, and then I've got a clump of grass. Then I'll duplicate that clump, move it around. I don't need a lot, just a little bit to suggest that he's grounded there. Here I am adding key light. I'm also going in on his skin. I'm turning on the subsurface with a red subsurface color to give it that red ambient undertone of skin. That goes a long way. Adding subsurface really makes a big difference. It's subtle, but man, it really adds a nice fleshy quality to 3D sculpts. So there you see I've painted some little grass spots. Here I'm adding a rim light, which just helps bring out his body from the background. And there's a fun little pixel filter I was messing with on the post-process. It doesn't quite give it the result I would like, but yeah. And so here's my final turnaround of Link here in Nomad. I've got that bloom on, and I'm really happy with the Nomad renderer here. And really, I couldn't leave well enough alone, so I did do a Blender render, but I'm pretty happy with this. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I may make this sculpt available for download on my Cults 3D, so look for that, and I'll catch you next time.